recording this meeting. So today's sign-in sheet, this is the link for it. Also, happy World Philosophy Day from the Consciousness Society. Today's agenda, I will begin with an Alzheimer awareness presentation, and then we will go on to Dr. Brown's slideshow, and then we will have some time for questions and a discussion. So my name is Angela, and I'm a volunteer community representative with the Alzheimer's Association. I volunteer because I believe in a vision for a world without Alzheimer's, as well as fostering greater knowledge about brain health. So in addition, I serve as the president of the Consciousness Society at the CUNY Grad Center, where we strive to create meaningful discussions around the mind and consciousness. So today's session is also an opportunity to celebrate World Philosophy Day and reflect on UNESCO's vision for a more inclusive and sustainable future. We'll begin our session today with a brief overview of some key statistics related to Alzheimer's disease and dementia, grounding us in the reality of these conditions' impact. From there, we'll explore how the Consciousness Society aligns its philanthropic mission to raise awareness and inspire action against the fight against Alzheimer's. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to an engaging discussion. So today, more than 6 million Americans have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and by 2050, that number is projected to rise to nearly 14 million. Over 11 million Americans provide unpaid care for people with Alzheimer and other dementias. The lifetime risk for Alzheimer's is at age 45, at 1 in 5 for women and 1 in 10 for men. As you can see, the numbers are staggering. Fortunately, the Alzheimer's Association is leading the way to end Alzheimer's and all other dementia around the world and in our community. To make sure we're all on the same page with some important definitions, let me tell you a little bit about dementia and Alzheimer's. Dementia is a general term for loss of memory, thinking, language, problem solving, and other abilities that are severe enough to interfere with daily life. Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. Dementia is not a single disease, it's an overall term, like heart disease, that covers a wide range of specific medical conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, although, does account for 60 to 80% of cases. Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. It is not a normal part of aging. The greatest known risk factor for Alzheimer's is increasing age, and the majority of people with Alzheimer's are 65 and older. Alzheimer's disease is considered to be younger onset Alzheimer's if it affects a person under 65. In some communities, the risk of Alzheimer's is even greater. Studies show that Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to develop Alzheimer's, and Hispanic Americans are 1.5 times more likely than non-Hispanic white Americans to develop the disease. Members of underserved diverse communities are more likely to endure poverty and have more limited access to quality health care. They are also less likely to pursue a diagnosis, receive support, and participate in a clinical trial. And the association is committed to engaging underrepresented and underserved communities and responding with resources and education to address the disproportionate impact of Alzheimer's and dementia. It can be challenging for all family members to accept changes in their roles and responsibilities. The demands of caregiving can limit a caregiver's ability to take care of themselves, and family caregivers of people with Alzheimer's and related dementias are at great risk for anxiety, depression, and poorer quality of life than caregivers of people with other conditions. Additionally, the lifetime cost of care for individuals with Alzheimer's is more than twice the amount incurred by individuals without Alzheimer's. So because Alzheimer's and dementia have such a profound effects on individuals, families, and whole communities, all of us should be equipped to recognize the warning signs. So here is a list of the 10 warning signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's, which can be subtle. The earlier someone is diagnosed, the more treatment may be available. Some medications are only effective in early stages of the disease. There is exciting progress in Alzheimer's and dementia research that is creating promising new treatments for people living with the disease. Today, there is a worldwide effort underway to find better ways to treat the disease, delay its onset, and prevent it from developing. In addition to the exciting advancements in treatment, there is more. As you can see, there are many reasons to feel hopeful about our vision of a world without Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. We believe people in our community deserve access to the services, programs, and awareness to diagnose and treat dementia, as well as support their journey. I want to make sure you know about the ways the Alzheimer's Association can help the community. The Alzheimer's Association website provides easy access to resources, community programs, and services in your local community. Our 24/7 helpline is available around the clock, 365 days a year, offering confidential support and information to people living with dementia, caregivers, families, and the public. And a great way to get started is by participating in your local Walk to End Alzheimer's or The Longest Day. The association has a variety of volunteer opportunities available to fit all interests, skills, and experience as well. And I hope you walk away today from this presentation having learned something you can use or share with someone who can. I look forward to hearing from those who are inspired to do more and help the Alzheimer's Association. And now I would like to pass it over to Dr. Brown.
Am I allowed to share my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so hi, my name is Richard Brown. Some of you guys I know, and some of you I don't know that I know of. So I am a faculty member in the MS Master of Science program in Cognitive Neuroscience. And I myself, a former graduate of the Graduate Center in Philosophy with an emphasis in cognitive science, a concentration in cognitive science, which I earned in 2008. So my work is largely focused on questions related to the empirical testability of certain philosophical and scientific theories of consciousness. And so what I wanted to talk about today is kind of what I think the main goal of a science of consciousness ought to be. And so this is by way of hopefully getting us to talk about some of these issues, and you can feel free to jump in at any time. I had it set to random, I think, so we'll see how much of these things actually come through. But so that's what I want to talk about today is what does it mean to construct a scientific theory of phenomenal consciousness? So for a long time, there was a legitimate question in early psychological science and the history of psychology, and then later translating into the cognitive neurosciences, as we know them now, about whether there could be a neuroscience of consciousness. There was always kind of interest in the question of consciousness, but it wasn't really thought that you could have it as a central area of study in its own right. So, for example, we have various areas like attention, learning and memory, visual perception. These are kind of areas that are standard, but they weren't always. So, in the history of psychology and neuroscience, attention itself was considered a bit of a strange question until it was figured out in the 80s and 70s and 80s, how to operationalize some of these questions. And then now there's an area you can go and work in called, neuroscience of attention. And there's all sorts of interesting questions. So one question you might have is, well, could there be something like that with respect to consciousness? And my answer that I want to suggest for discussion today is that I think the answer is yes, there is such a thing as the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, and that it's got a particular goal and should be thought of in a particular way. So just by way of plugging, I'll mention, probably you guys already know about this, but there are 2 conferences devoted to the scientific study of consciousness. One of them, the kind of traditional Tucson conference, as it's called the Science of Consciousness, is very inclusive, and you'll find everything from sort of ordinary neuroscience to more magnificent things along the spectrum that maybe are not as testable. So it's much more inclusive in a way. And then there's the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which tries to be a little more like, let's be like regular cognitive neuroscience, although there's still a good healthy mix of empirical and philosophical issues, and they have a journal, The Neuroscience of Consciousness. So if you are, I know many of you, I know some of you already know this. So uh, for those who don't, though, I like to kind of point out that this is an attempt to try to take this area and turn it into a respectable subdiscipline of neuroscience. Um, so what is the actual goal? What is the target of a neuroscience of consciousness? My view is that the primary target is something that philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, which these slide animations are off, but that's okay. So that's introduced by this gentleman who's here. That's Thomas Nagel. He's a philosopher at NYU, and he wrote this famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Where he asked the question, basically, what is it like to be a bat? And define this idea of consciousness as there being something that it's like from your point of view. So that when we talk about phenomenal consciousness, we mean something what you could say had a certain kind of first person access, by which we mean that the way things are from your point of view is known by you in a distinct sort of way. It certainly at least seems like someone who only had access to what your brain was doing may look at the brain processes that you had when you were experiencing pain or something like that. And they would know perhaps about your pain, but not in the same way that you yourself know about it from the first person point of view. So phenomenal consciousness has something to do with this special way of accessing our own mental life. It has something to do with being subjective, seeming from our point of view to be a certain way. Uh, um, in the case that to really fully understand what it's like to be another creature, you kind of have to take that point of view. So that was kind of Nagel's point in the bat paper, was that bats are mammals, but they have very different sensory systems. And so it seems hard for us to know what it would be like to be the bat, even if we knew everything about its brain neurophysiologically. Um, so the question then of phenomenal consciousness is this extra thing. What is it like from the bat's point of view? And in addition, there seems to be something that philosophers like to call intentionality, which we often just identify with the notion of representation. So phenomenal states of your conscious life, depict the world as being in particular ways. So when I have an experience of a red apple, the world appears to me to contain something red. So that aboutness of my experience, putting a condition on the world for being accurate or inaccurate, seems like an important part of what it means to have phenomenal consciousness. So many people have wondered whether there could even really be a science of something which had these kinds of properties, or whether something like this could even be a physical state at all. So some people think that if you even bring up the notion of phenomenal consciousness, that immediately invokes some kind of non-physical thing that has these extra scientific properties. But as I understand these things, that isn't the case. So this is, in my opinion, what the science of consciousness wants to understand. What we want to understand in some sense is how to control and understand these kinds of processes, so that if we had a theory that allowed us to change different aspects of a person's first person subjective or intentional world by manipulating states of their brain, that would go a long way towards helping us understand the nature of this thing. And in addition, there are many other concepts of consciousness, which we sort of want. One of the main questions that arises in this area is what the relation of that notion of consciousness as experience, as what it's like from my point of view, has to do with these other notions. And now I see everything's just coming out all at once. It was spacing nicely for a second, but I don't know what happened. Anyway, so one distinction that we would like to make is the notion that sometimes is called creature consciousness. By the way, I have this timed out to be about 23 minutes. So um, I hope that's okay. But anytime anyone wants to jump in, feel free to. I'm happy with that, or just wait until the end. But anyway, so distinction here is the distinction between being awake and being asleep. So when organisms are awake, they're alert and responsive to the world. They're alert to a certain degree or other, and responsive to their external environment along certain dimensions and not other dimensions. And when they're unconscious or asleep, then they're not responsive in that way. So creature consciousness, as such, seems to involve this notion of either being awake or asleep. And we know that this is a kind of scale, and there are different areas that you could land up that are interesting in this area. But they both all come apart from the notion of phenomenal consciousness that I was mentioning a second ago. Because, for example, if you're asleep, you could have a dream. That's being phenomenally conscious while you're asleep. And on the reverse side, we have a notion which in the old days, I guess, was called the vegetative state, but I think is now more properly called unresponsive wakefulness. And in unresponsive wakefulness, patients have sleeping and waking cycles, but they don't show any sense of being aware of where they are or responding to stimuli in a reliable way. So you might ask yourself, well, was there something that it is like for the subject uh, in an unresponsive wakefulness sort of state, or is there nothing that it's like? And so the question that is important is the notion of phenomenal consciousness and what its relation is to creature consciousness. Another distinction in this area that's important to bring up is just the notion of awareness itself, generally speaking. Sometimes this is called transitive consciousness. Sometimes it isn't, but the general notion is being conscious of something as opposed to being unaware of that thing. So when I see a red apple in front of me and I say that I am aware of that apple, what that means is that I can act appropriately with response to the apple. I can reach out and grab it, in which case we would say there are states inside of my brain which are allowing me to do this sort of action, to reach over there and grab the apple. And then the question is that's going to arise is whether this kind of awareness is involved importantly in consciousness. And as we'll see, a lot of theories of consciousness in the cognitive neurosciences take consciousness to be a kind of awareness. And on the other hand, then so in that case, they would say phenomenal consciousness is a kind of awareness that you could take one and explain it in terms of the other. On the other hand, there are notions of self-consciousness. And in these kinds of cases, what we want to talk about is being aware of yourself in a unique kind of way, maybe in a first personal way, as being a mental agent or as being an object in the world, distinct from other ones. So some people think that the notion of phenomenal consciousness is importantly bound up with self-consciousness, and others don't. And as I'll just talk briefly about each of the theories in just a moment, you'll sort of see that on this scale right here, they help themselves to different components of this kind of psychological toolkit to try to explain what consciousness is. We could kind of bracket all of these under the umbrella of the distinction between experience on the one hand and what Ned Block, the philosopher at NYU, called access consciousness. So this is a distinction he made in the 90s, but I think it's still very important. Access consciousness, as Block defined it, had to do with a state being poised or ready or available to be used in the guiding of behavior or in a rational thought process, in the process of reasoning. So that was a kind of accessing of information in the brain. It's one thing to have some information in the brain about the external environment. It's another thing for the brain to use that information as a way to control the body and navigate the world or control thoughts and so forth and so on. So what we could see actually is that each one of these distinctions that we were talking about before all kind of involve the question of what the relationship of cognitive access on the one hand, issues having to do with attention and working memory, and experience in the sense of the subjective first personal awareness of the world that each of us and of our own mental life that each of us has. So I sort of see that as one of the fundamental issues in the science of consciousness is what is the relationship between the kinds of things which the cognitive neurosciences propose to exist in terms of cognitive functioning and the notion of experience. And what we saw in the previous cases was that in each case we looked at, there was a question about what the relation was between phenomenal consciousness and this kind of cognitive accessibility. And what ultimately this points us to, I have a couple of other issues here that I would say are kind of the fundamental issues in the science of consciousness, which I was going to run through, but maybe I'll just briefly say something in the interest of time. But one is the question of whether consciousness is rich or sparse in the sense of being as detailed as we naively think it to be. And if you know about change blindness and inattentional blindness, then the question often arises there. For example, if you're looking at a picture of a sofa and there's a square pillow that's there in one picture and missing in a second picture, and they're going back and forth between these two pictures very quickly, and you're looking at that and you don't notice that the pillow is missing in one. Many people don't notice these kinds of changes. That's change blindness. In such cases, a natural question is whether you had an experience of the pillow that was there and were unable to report it, or whether the experience is exactly as you report it. And since you report that you don't see a difference between them, maybe you experience the two pictures in the same way as not having that extra pillow. So that question again seems to involve issues of the relation between cognitive accessibility and phenomenal consciousness. And then finally, asking questions about the neural correlates of consciousness. For example, asking if the prefrontal cortex is importantly involved or whether there are components. You can have consciousness just based in the parietal or sensory areas. Each one of these questions ultimately involves questions about the relationship between cognitive access and phenomenal consciousness. And I don't think that you're able to answer these kinds of questions without first saying something about what you think a theory of consciousness is supposed to look like. And it seems to me that we have a few kind of big ideas in the cognitive neuroscience right now related to consciousness. And that's not to say this is everything that's ever been said about consciousness, but there's a few kind of big ideas that are out there. And we're at a point where we really want to try to empirically test theories of consciousness. So in order to narrow down the subject field, perhaps because there's maybe too many big ideas. I think in one case we have an example of exactly that sort of thing. So if you're thinking about consciousness in terms of being subjective, and we mentioned already that it seems to be fundamentally tied to the notion of awareness, because when you experience the world as being a certain way, you're aware of the world in that particular way. So we see kind of two, and if awareness is a kind of intentionality, which is ultimately going to be understood as representation, then what we can see is well, I'm kind of fumbling on how I want to express it, but the idea being that what we can see is that many theories of consciousness appeal to the notion of a kind of representation in their basic list of things which are in explanatory, doing explanatory work. And so if awareness is a kind of representation, then we can see that there really are two types of awareness which you might want to appeal to. And this is, I think, a really important distinction in theorizing about consciousness. And this is the distinction between higher order and first order theories of consciousness. So first order theories of consciousness say that experience requires only a certain kind of awareness of the external environment, whereas higher order theories say that in addition to that awareness of the external environment, you also may need some kind of awareness of that first order state. So now, most of the theories of consciousness that we have out there are based on one of these big ideas right here. So for example, taking the first one, this is Giulio Tononi. He introduced the integrated information theory of consciousness, whereby he suggested that consciousness was the integration of information, which is roughly speaking, how much causal power a system has, which is due uniquely to that system and can't be reproduced by any subcomponents of that system. So that information would be integrated in that sense, because any component of the system that was cut out, then the whole functionality of that thing was lost. And there's a lot of mathematics behind this. It's a very elegant theory. And so some people have questioned whether it actually is a scientific theory or whether it's more of a metaphysical theory. There's currently a kind of controversy around it, which is sort of what you would expect if the science of consciousness were becoming its own kind of sub-discipline. There would be questions about what it was supposed to cover and what it wasn't supposed to cover. And if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk about that kind of stuff. But more kind of to my purposes is that the integration of information seems to be done in many places in the brain, and it seems to be more geared towards a theory of the content or intelligence as opposed to consciousness. So that's something that I would say is more of a problem with IIT is explaining the connection that it has to consciousness. And then also, it's clear that it's kind of a first order theory because it says that there are certain patterns of integrated information, which just are my awareness of the apple in the external environment. And you could have a higher order version of that, which said, okay, so you need that plus some inner awareness of that kind of thing. So I think that's interesting. Now, the global workspace theory, this is Bernard Bars and Stanislaw Dehaene. These Bars was kind of the originator in the 80s of the global workspace theory. I think this is in some sense the most popular theory of consciousness. It's the one that's been studied the most empirically, I think. At least, just as Dehaene's work is very prolific and has a lot of important graduate students and postdocs and so forth that have gone through his labs and so forth and so on. So the basic idea of the global workspace is that information in the brain needs to be widely shared among different processing modules in order to become conscious. And you don't experience what you experience is just what's in the globally shared network. And that allows information to exist in the brain that's not globally shared. This has been interpreted in terms of long-range neurons projecting from sensory areas to the prefrontal cortex. So information might be transmitted to a global workspace, maybe located in these interconnected neurons in the prefrontal cortex, and in which case, a state of awareness of the external environment, which was then globally broadcast in this way, would be the conscious state. So this is still a first order kind of theory because it maintains that all that's required for consciousness is that there be a representation of the external environment, which is shared in this widespread way, and then it becomes conscious. Of course, you could take that as being a necessary component, but not sufficient. And you might try to develop a higher order version of global workspace theory. So my point here is not that you should do that, but that you could, which illustrates that global workspace theory itself is being offered as a first order theory, but it's not necessarily the case. Finally, we have issues about attention. So here's two guys, Jesse Prinz and Michael Graziano. I think the Prinz case is a case where we really have seen sort of empirical work bear on a theory of consciousness, because people who think that attention is consciousness, and this was one of them who had that view. I think that empirically, there's a lot of reasons for believing that you could have attention without consciousness, so unconscious attention, and consciousness without attention, so that we have an empirical reason to think that they come apart. That doesn't mean that attention might not be important. And Graziano's idea is that consciousness is the attention schema, which is a kind of representation of what we're tending to at a higher order level. So immediately the question of is this a higher order theory comes into mind. Graziano has written in places maybe saying somewhat maybe yes, maybe no. So this illustrates, I think, that the idea that Graziano has is maybe groping towards something like a higher order sort of theory. So once again, it's good to see the landscape in that sort of division. And then finally at the end, we have some predictive coding stuff. I'm not sure how much people know about this stuff, but the predictive coding idea is basically taking the brain to be generating estimations of what it expects to get from its model of the way maybe the world is, so that there's a kind of difference between what it expected and what it actually gets, that you could call it the error. And that the job of the brain is to try to predict this kind of the best match that it can to the incoming signal, and that might be somehow generally important for consciousness. So this is Andy Clark and Jakob Howie down here. That's Anil Seth, who's also very much interested in this. So these are just some current people you may or may not know. That's Alan Hobson, who also kind of converted to this towards the end. He was a sleep researcher. So, okay, you guys don't need to know too much about this, but these are just like some of the big ideas that we have. And that's kind of my subtext of this talk, is that I think that the neuroscience of consciousness has as its job to try to narrow down the space. We've seen in one case, I think, attention, where it's done its job, but now we would like to see these other kinds of theories uh, also be weeded down. But also, and then kind of grand finale here is that just as we saw higher first order theories come in this wide variety of range, higher order theories, the idea that there is some kind of inner awareness, an awareness of the mind, which is somehow important in phenomenal consciousness, is also a family of theories. And there's a lot of differing kinds of, at the psychological level, what kind of awareness would be involved inside monitoring the mind, what kind of representations are involved, what mechanisms. So that's in a whole exciting other area. I have a book that's coming out on that. So if anyone cares about that, I'd love to talk about that. But the idea is that we should start thinking of the landscape in the neuroscience of consciousness as involving this kind of empirical battle between the higher order and the first order. And we would like to narrow down the list of candidates. So I see that as kind of one of the central jobs of the neuroscience of consciousness. All right, so I'll stop there and open it up for discussion.
We have a few questions in the chat.
Cool.
Can I ask a question not in chat? Okay, I'm gonna do it. Okay, so I have a sister who works in organ donation, and I was wondering how thinking about consciousness and how it is changing affects organ donation, because a huge part of it is brain death, but then brain death is not yes or no.
Yeah. So how thinking about consciousness affects that? That's what you're asking?
Yeah, because I know that even within the medical community, the idea of conscious versus non-conscious is not black and white, and then the study of it as well. So how does studying it scientifically influence how we think about organ donation?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so one thing that's kind of hard to square in this area, another kind of result of the way we think about phenomenal consciousness from the first person subjective point of view, is that it seems very hard to make sense of the idea that it comes in gradations. So in the sense that if there's something that it's like for you, then that seems like a binary kind of thing. There either is, from your point of view, something that it's like to exist in the world, or there isn't. Now we could imagine that what it's like for you is like very dim. The specific nature of the experience might be very, low level, degraded, etc. But there either is or isn't something that it's like, you might argue. And in the case of death, especially with respect to brain death, so brain destruction, you're correct, is not all or none, and there is a debate about how much of the brain needs to be destroyed in order to say that the person is dead. And as far as I understand it, it's catastrophic destruction of areas related to the self, and memory and planning and so forth that are taken to be sort of the ones that are most prominently featured, at least. I mean, I'm no expert on this aspect of things by far, but this is my understanding. So that could come in degrees. So thinking about what your theory of consciousness might say about those kinds of cases is a very interesting question. And as far as I know, no one's really taken like from that point of view, like, here's the global workspace theory of consciousness. What would it say in this or that kind of case? So I think that's very interesting. How it relates to organ donation, I think, is gonna connect up to the question of like what the theory of consciousness says about what it means to be dead, or when you actually are dead. If as I think, sort of maybe thinking about your question, it seems like death should be defined not so much in terms of destruction of the brain, but cessation of the experience of the self, of the way the world is, which is a lot harder to determine. So you would need to have an answer to the question about what theory of consciousness is the correct one, and then when those processes in the brain are destroyed or irreversibly taken offline, then that would be death. That might be one way that it would relate.
That almost makes me like, like kind of think, is consciousness tied to, I guess, aware of one's everything in terms of like one's belief and stuff, like, because like just going off of what she said with organ donation and then taking it further about um assisted, what is it, like assisted death in the hospital, where a medical professional is given that option. I mean, obviously in a lot of, it's ethically, one may say it's wrong, but it is, if the person is asking and they're in a conscious state, does that mean that the reason why they're asking is because there is some type of disruption in their conscious identity of oneself to say, this is not who I am anymore or want to be because I am, in this state of mind right now cognitively. Therefore, I may need your help. So I guess it's kind of like, it is very hard to like distinguish, I guess, that between that in consciousness in the hospital sense, because it also goes into ethics and I guess God complex also. I was looking at one of the questions where I think Christian is asking, is like, is consciousness as self-evident as
Yeah, there's
existence?
some questions in the chat um, from Christian.
Yeah.
So one of them, the first one is, are you a materialist? If you are, do you reduce consciousness to physical components?
So I don't think of myself as a materialist or a physicalist, but I think of myself as someone who thinks that physicalism hasn't been refuted, and that I wonder why a lot of people think it has. So in that sense, I'm very friendly to physicalism. So my official position is that we don't know if it's false. So it could be true. So that doesn't make me a physicalist, but it does mean that I don't think that it's been refuted in any way, so that I don't think that conceivability arguments or anything like that tell against it. And I also think that we have some reasonable evidence against other sorts of views, in the sense that one kind of prediction that dualism makes hasn't been seen, that we don't have evidence for it, namely that there would be some kind of energy detected in the brain which didn't have a physical cause, some sort of cell in the brain which seemed to fire an action potential or had an ion channel open or close, where the antecedent cause wasn't some physical force, but rather some we know not what, if the mind really were some kind of non-physical substance which was acting on the brain in order to produce the physical behavior, then you would predict that that would occur. And I'm not saying that we won't ever discover that, because, you know, we discover all sorts of new things, but we certainly haven't discovered it yet, which I think is sort of mildly suggestive that perhaps it's not there. So I don't think the conceivability arguments tell against it. And I think there's some empirical reason for thinking that dualism isn't exactly working out. And those two together are making me kind of go, yeah, all things considered, I think physicalism is a serious contender, and hasn't been, it should be in a way almost close to one of the top default views, you know, that people just kind of have in the background. If so, do I reduce consciousness to physical components? Yeah. So when it comes to the question of reduction, I think that the question is important. So if consciousness is a physical process, then you haven't really reduced anything in one important sense of, like, the number of things in the world stays the same. There still is consciousness and there still is that physical activity. But if they are the same thing, if one is the other, then I don't know if you would call that reduction. Now, in another sense, you could say you've theoretically reduced it in the sense of, well, the words you use in this theory actually turn out to be equivalent to using the words of the other theory in this way. So if those words are like, you know, I feel a pain, and the other one is brain state X95 occurs, then maybe there's a theoretical reduction like that, but nothing about like getting rid of consciousness or something like that. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say about this or not, but that's how I would respond to the question.
I'll add on a little bit. Um, so there has been some evidence that there is, some electrical activity happening even after the heart ceases to beat. And I think that's where a lot of these types of questions come from. And then also you have a lot of people who have spoke of near-death experiences. My own father, when he was a child, almost drowned and had an out-of-body experience. And as he describes it, he was like watching the lifeguards work on him and his mom freaking out. So I do understand where the question comes from. Is consciousness a completely physical aspect within one's body? And I could see where people go into the more spiritual aspects of it, of thinking that that might not be the case. But we definitely don't really have evidence to lead, not good empirical evidence to really lead us out, beyond the physical realm.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that I don't know that physicalism is true. I sort of think there's some reason to take it seriously, but at the same time, certain versions of dualism or spiritualism are also plausible. And it's really hard when you get into the philosophy of science of this to say, well, what is it like? So are we sure that something supernatural is going on here? Because it could turn out that there's some purely natural explanation in terms of a scientific principle that we don't yet understand. And the analogy here would be how we discovered electricity, prior to which we had no idea that it was a force of nature, or that the brain generated electrical signals or anything of that nature. And then we discovered the stuff in nature, lightning, was electricity. And then also, like, within a few decades, discovered that the brain had electricity in it. And it was very surprising at the time. which is where we get statements like nervous energy and why Frankenstein's brought to life by lightning and all these kinds of things that we know and love, as kind of a direct result of that idea that people were just kind of blown away by the fact that this new force of nature was in the brain, like it's electrical. So to us, that sort of seems like, yeah, duh, neurons and ions and so forth. But at this time, that was a newly discovered force of nature, and then quite shockingly played an important role in neural functioning. So the idea would be that something like that could happen again. It's not inconceivable that we discover something else, which I don't know what, because we haven't discovered it, but it's not inconceivable that we discover something else and then also realize that plays an important role in the brain functioning. So at this point in time, we're really focused on spike trains and neurons. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but I'm also saying that as scientists, we have to kind of be aware that science proceeds in this way, and it is a possibility. So that's something that we should always have in the back of our mind. And therefore, even these things that we think of as spiritual or ESP or ghosts or whatever, out-of-body experiences, each one of these things may possibly be explainable in some naturalistic sense in terms of something we don't understand. Or it may turn out to be some kind of ordinary cognitive explanation. Like, for example, I've always thought that the deja vu kinds of experiences can be explained by priming results from memory science coupled with the idea that there's unconscious activation, so that you walk into someone's house and in the background is a kind of carpet that reminds you of your house when you were a child. So unconsciously, a memory is cued. You don't experience it because it occurs unconsciously. But nonetheless, you have this feeling like something very familiar is happening. So you erroneously think that it's something about your external environment that's very familiar. And you start saying things like, you said that before. But really, it's just you hearing them say that under the context of thinking something is very familiar because of the unconscious memory. And now I'm not saying that that totally is known to be a good explanation for deja vu, but it seems to me to be a plausible alternative to the idea that it really is like, some sort of deja vu feeling. I know it's not the same as the example that was brought up of near-death experiences, but even there you could kind of see, I think, how you could possibly start to tell a story about how those kind of near-death experiences are the result of normal brain functioning gone awry because of conditions at the end of the life. So I'm not saying that that's known either, but that there's room for both. And this is an area where that's why I mentioned the Tucson conference at the beginning, as well as the ASSC, because I think that when it comes to consciousness, it's an area where we want both kinds of thinking. We want far out there sort of thinking and sort of more workaday thinking. We want them both. We want to identify small problems that we can make progress on, as well as keep our eye out for big new ideas that we haven't thought of. So in that sense, I think that all this stuff is near-death experiences and all sorts of paranormal stuff is worth taking into consideration. It's important, and that shouldn't be dismissed at a hand.
Another big question we have is, what is the relationship between consciousness and epistemology?
Okay, that's a good question for World Philosophy Day. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. And of course, the word consciousness kind of is just the meaning of the actual word consciousness comes from its root, which means to know or to know with. So that the idea was that when you and I both know about the same stuff, we're conscious of it together. So in that sense, the kind of origin of the word is bound up with the idea of knowing about the external world. And the way that we use it nowadays in terms of the subjective experience doesn't seem to be exactly that anymore. We've honed in on the kind of subjective, first personal way things appear from your point of view. But that's often thought to be very important in epistemology in the sense of that experiences play justifying roles in my beliefs. So one kind of obvious example is my beliefs about consciousness. So if I have a belief that I know about my experiences in a kind of direct and immediate way, and then I have an experience of pain, my tooth is hurting, and I reflect just on that pain at that moment, thinking to myself, this pain right here has this way of feeling to me. It's very awful, but it's not as bad as that pain I had when I stub my toe, or whatever kind of thought you may have. That's kind of allows you to know something about the nature of the experience itself. And some people have taken that to be kind of another argument against the notion that the pain is a physical state, because if you know everything there is to know about pain by simply experiencing the pain, then it seems like you kind of immediately know, well, you don't experience it as a brain state. This is what the philosopher Philip Goff has called revelation. Revelation is the idea that the brains that the conscious experiences reveal to the subject their entire nature. That just by having the experience, you know everything that there is to know about that experience. In which case, it would be a kind of easy step from there to the idea that it's not physical, because you don't know it in that way. So that's one way that epistemology and consciousness would be very tightly related, because that's, a lot of people take that argument very seriously. So for my own part, I would just say that it's not clear that we really do have that kind of immediate knowledge, as opposed to merely seem to. So if it just seemed to us that we had this kind of direct, immediate relationship to our conscious experiences, then we would still have all the same beliefs. This is what's largely called a debunking explanation, so that you kind of try to show that you'd end up with the same beliefs without that kind of thing being there. But so I'm not sure that we do have that kind of knowledge. And I do think that maybe when we introspect our own mental states, there's the possibility of making mistakes about which states we're in, being confused about what actual states that we occupy. So I think those are all empirical issues, but I think that there's some reason to think that. So anyway, I think that's but did you have something else in mind, or whoever asked that question? Was that?
If they get to you, I just want to ask one last one. So we have,
Okay.
do you believe consciousness is aware of reality in itself, or do you follow a Kantian dichotomy of the noumenal versus the phenomenal?
Oh, that's a good deep question. So I guess I generally tend towards a kind of agnosticism in most things, and don't have real strong views. I sort of have as a natural default view a kind of, we are in the world as it is, that naive kind of optimism about the nature of the external world. I think that Kant's transcendental idealism, the idea that the physical world that we think of as real is just the world of experience, and that the true nature of the world cannot really even be known or talked about in a coherent way, because every time that we try to do that, we ultimately talk about it as if it's part of our experienced world, when it can't be, because it's the world as it is, free and clear of all experience. So that Kant, sort of the main lesson, if you like this philosopher, the main lesson you could take from him is that it's a mistake to ever talk about anything except experience, and you can't ever go beyond experience. So I think that way of thinking about things stems from a certain view of perception. The nature of perception, according to this view, being that you don't directly perceive the external world, but rather perceive experiences which are representing or standing for the external world. The idea, which kind of originates in the British empiricists of John Locke and David Hume, and gets carried on through, probably was there in Descartes in some version, But the idea being that what you think of as the physical world around you really is just a mental representation in the mind, constructed by the mind, of some unknowable external reality called the noumenal world. So if you have that theory of perception, and maybe there's good reasons for thinking of that as true, then that is, you're kind of led there. I think the modern notion of representation, the one that we find in the neurosciences nowadays, is taken more from computer science than it is from kind of paintings, which is what it was in Hume and Locke's day. They would have thought of experience as kind of like a painting that you interacted with as a way to interact with the external world. But you didn't see the external world, you saw the painting. Sometimes this was called the veil of experience. The modern version of representationalism says you represent the external world, but not by having a little picture of it, but rather by having informational states which co-vary with the states of the world in some reliable or predictable way. So that when you have a set of neurons that are behaving in this or that way by firing in unison at a certain frequency or whatever have you, and they only do that in the presence of a certain stimuli, and when that stimuli is there, they do that, then you can say that these things reliably co-vary, or one carries information about the other, and then you kind of build up from there. So that the notion of representation is that starts with the idea of there's something in the external world which produces in you this activity, which is kind of not the Kantian idea, because you start with the existence of the external world and the idea that perception puts you in contact with that external world, as opposed to putting you in contact with a representation of it. Now, that's not to say that you don't represent it, you do, but you represent it in a kind of linguistic, semi-linguistic way, as opposed to a pictorial way. So I think that this is an important question, and you could go. I mean, you could be a scientist and go either way, but that my own kind of background, natural proclivities are with the kind of naive view. Although I think that there are strong reasons for thinking that the other view is right. So, for example, if you ask neuroscientists, does the color red exist? Is the apple really red? They tend to say no. And even like the textbook in intro neuroscience classes and perception textbooks say, well, you know, the physical light is not red. The apple absorbs most of the spectrum, so it only reflects red light, don't you know? But if you want to say the color of the apple is the light that it absorbed, doesn't that make more sense? Then it'd be a very different color. So the whole idea of the apple being red is kind of confused, according to the modern neuroscientific view. What's red is the experience that's produced in you in response to the property that the apple has of reflecting light of a certain kind. So this is where you get the idea then that maybe there's something about the nature of consciousness itself that allows us to fundamentally know about the external world or be a justifier. So all these questions that you guys are asking come together. I see it's over 4:30 now, so I'll stop rambling. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Brown. So that's, we're going to wrap up questions for this part of the series, but we appreciate you joining us for the first part to Consciousness Explained. And for anyone who didn't get to, I'm going to share my screen again. If you are a student at the GC, you can sign in using this link. And also, when you sign in on the Google form, you will see the DGSC portal where you can become part of our roster for our organization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's fun. I wish I
Thank
could. If you guys
you.
send me emails with more questions, I'm sorry if I can't.
Thank you.
And
Can't see them all.
definitely let us know when you're done with your book.
Yes, please. We would love to hear more about it, honestly.
Cool. Well, it should be out in early next year. So it's in the production stage now. So they're doing the copy editing and stuff. So it's on the way.
What will the name of it be?
Congratulations.
The name is Consciousness as Representing One's Mind.
Okay, cool. Keep an eye out
Yeah.
for it.
It's an exploration of the empirical interpretation of higher order theory, sort of the second half of this talk. So I'll come back, when it comes out.